Hey y'all, what is up? Future Keasbey here, and I just wanted to give you a heads up that this video was recorded before the new support was announced, so if you notice that I don't mention it or reference it whatsoever, despite the fact that throughout the Memento coverage I have referenced future support, that is why. Anyway, enjoy the video. Hey y'all, what is up? Keasbey here, and it's time. Legacy of Destruction drops very soon, or already if you're late to this video. So we're going to be looking at my updated Memento deck profile. But before we get into all that, don't forget to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel for even more. Okay, a few notes up top. As always, first, if you aren't familiar with Memento and are checking this out because you've seen the new support, be sure to check out the other videos we have on the channel that break down this deck in depth. We previously did a deck profile that covers very in-depth every card in the deck, why we play them, their shared mechanics, some ruling stuff, and even a few combos. While that deck profile itself is outdated, I do recommend checking it out for information outside of the list itself. We also have a video covering the various one-card combos this deck has access to, and a test hand video showing what we can do with more than one card. Next, to avoid making this a massively long video, we're only going to go in depth when we hit the changes or updates to the deck, so again, check out the other videos for a more in-depth look at the archetype itself. And lastly, this deck is mostly budget friendly, but for the part that mainly isn't, I will call out alternatives. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's kick off the deck. First off, we are on triple copies of Memento Darkblade, one of our 4 one-card starters. Following that up, we are on 3 copies of Memento Anguish, the second of our 4 one-card engines, and an in-archetype spellcaster, which does come up a lot. After that, we're on triple copies of Memento Tatsuno Toshigo. I mused about trying out 2 copies of this at one point, but the fact that it is an in-archetype special summon insists that we should be on 3 copies of these. Additionally as well, he is another one of our one-card starters. And let's get into some changes from the previous list. We're only rocking 1 copy of Memento Goblin. So we're down to 1 copy despite Goblin being a 1-card starter. It is unfortunately the weakest of our 1-card combos and generally serves way better at the point in other combos where you would be recruiting for him anyway. Generally speaking, we don't want to open multiples of any of our Mementos, but Darkblade and Anguish give us significantly stronger boards on their own, and while Tatsu's 1-card combo is essentially Goblin's 1-card combo just done in a different order, Tatsu can natively special summon itself while Goblin cannot. After a ton of testing, I haven't really missed that second copy of Goblin, and it's helped us get our deck count down a bit, raising the good stuff density level overall. Next up, another reduction, only 1 copy of Memento Mace. So Mace is officially our first non-self-starting card. Her effect to quick play change of heart on your opponent's turn is very strong, but it is a hard once per turn, and we have fairly easy access to her natively on our opponent's turn, or depending on the situation, or if you open with one of the 1.5 or 2 card combos, it is remarkably easy to get use of her effect early in our combo and then add her to our hand later in the turn. The great thing about this deck is while there are a lot of defined start and end points to your lines, the how you get there can vary wildly depending on the situation or opponent interaction, meaning that the above mentioned use Mace early, search her again later is incredibly viable. Like with Goblin, this was just to reduce deck count, and again, I haven't missed having access to multiple copies since cutting down to 1. It's just been a little bit of reworking to some of the extended combo lines that this deck can do. Next up, 1 copy of Memento Gaddock. Nothing new to talk about here. Following that up, 1 copy of Memento Horned Dragon. I do want to recommend, if you aren't already familiar, that you go check out the section on Horned Dragon in the original deck profile, as we go through a very cool play that this deck has fairly solid access to that involves this card and Bone Party. And closing out our main deck Mementos, we're on 1 copy of Memento Combined Creation. So that is our Memento main deck monsters. Let's get into the spells and traps. For the biggest departure from the previous list, we're only on 1 copy of the field spell, Mementotlan. So I made a comparison in the previous video that I really have to eat my words on, where I said that this had a similar vibe to Magnificent Map in Flandreese, in that it was a strong field spell that didn't self-start your plays, but rather extended what they can do. While this is technically true, it is also like saying that the ocean and a small pond are the same because they're both bodies of water. While Map jumpstarts your plays in a way where it's incredibly beneficial that you kick things off with it, Memento's own field spell really only does that with Tatsuno Otoshigo, and even then it's not offering that much more in the way of an end board than you would get if you searched it natively in your own combo, generally just one additional piece of interaction at the end of it. Unlike with Map, it doesn't offer any protection or additional resources out of the deck. Rather, it will give you more use out of the resources that you're recruiting throughout your combo, and the combos all function in a way where searching this early versus searching this late isn't too much of a difference beyond convenience. While it is a strong part of the archetype, and don't get me wrong, I would not play the deck without it, because we can so easily search it naturally and then there's no urgency as to when we use it, running one of them has felt just fine, and between running it at one and cutting the terraforming, it again gives us more room for generic good stuff while keeping to the lower deck count that we're shooting for. Next up, a card that is a must play at 3, however, Memento Bone Party. This is this deck's advent of adventure, and I will absolutely stand by that. And now time for the fresh support. We're on double copies of Memento Fusion. One thing that I do want to highlight that I don't think I highlighted enough, the part of the effect that allows you to shuffle monsters from your graveyard as fusion materials if a monster you control has been destroyed this turn is generic, in that A, if the materials align, you can fusion summon a non-memento monster with graveyard materials, and B, if a non-memento monster you control is destroyed, this effect is live. And on that note, the in-graveyard effect to banish the fusion spell to destroy a monster you control for a search does work with any monster, again, not just your mementos. Next up, one copy of Memento Cranium Burst. A quick note about this card that is going to become very relevant when playing in paper. Cranium Burst has a secondary effect that forces your opponent's monsters to attack the memento monster you control with the highest attack on field. Not only does this mean that they have to attack, it means that if your opponent controls any monster capable of attacking, they cannot skip their battle phase and must enter it and swing into your biggest memento, most likely combined creation, as much as possible. Do not miss out on this, and keep it in mind if there is anything on field that can attack, do not let your opponent end their turn without going into the battle phase. And closing out our memento spells and traps, we are on one copy of Memento Fracture Dance. Okay, so a little bit of talking here. We're at a 42 card deck right now, and if you really want to drop down to 40, this is actually one spot where you could consider a cut. Fracture Dance is a strong card, don't get me wrong, but with the much more consistent access to ending on Horn Dragon with Bone Party in rotation, we do have a very solid double destruction available to us in that combination. I will say up front, I'm personally going to keep Fracture Dance in the deck and play it at 42 cards. Cutting it down doesn't really affect our odds of seeing anything too much, but I do just want to lay out the reasons why or why not for it so that you can make a decision on your own. Again, like I said, Bone Party plus Horn Dragon is a double pop of our opponents or any face-up cards at the quote-unquote cost of destroying one of our own memento cards as well. However, by using Bone Party to special summon Gaddock, you not only get the Horn Dragon destruction, you get Gaddock's recovery effect, plus we can then target that Gaddock with Horn Dragon, and since Gaddock then goes to the graveyard via a memento effect here, you also get Gaddock coming back to the field as a free body for the crackback down the line. This is a remarkably strong swing play that this deck can consistently do, so a lot of times, if I have to choose, I'm grabbing the Bone Party over Fracture Dance during my turn. Now, this is based on a blind Game 1 situation. Fracture Dance does still have some distinct advantages over this play though, and this is why I think it's worth the deck slot. First, the destruction effect of Horn Dragon is a mandatory 3-target effect. This can be mitigated pretty easily, but still, it is absolutely worth mentioning. Fracture Dance, on the other hand, doesn't need to have multiple targets and can be used to snipe out a single card in a pinch. Another area that Fracture Dance excels at is that it's good as a direct response to continuous spells and traps with on-field activations or ignition effects. So if your opponent activates one of these with an on-activation trigger effect, Bone Party plus Horn Dragon will miss out on stopping the effect from resolving, since if you responded directly to it, Bone Party would be on the same chain as the field spell, and then Horn Dragon would activate on a new chain once everything had already resolved. Fracture Dance, however, is just a simple target and destroy, and it will stop said spell from ever resolving properly. Additionally, for any continuous spells with hard once per turn ignitions, Fracture Dance can be used in response to the activation of that effect so that your opponent totally misses out on it, versus the Bone Party Horn Dragon combo being needed to be used preemptively, running the risk of your opponent having a second copy of that card. Additionally as well, the secondary destruction after the first destruction happens via Fracture Dance is non-targeting, and this two-step resolution does play around some weird protection style effects, letting you clear the card that is protecting everything, and then with the second destruction actually clear whatever was being protected afterwards. And lastly, Fracture Dance can hit face down cards, whereas Horn Dragon cannot. To sum this all up, if you want a more condensed deck, you can cut Fracture Dance, and again, it is usually the last back row that I'll search if I have an extra search. Generally, you can get 3 out of 5 of your back row off of a Darkblade or Anguish solo opening, one of them being the fusion spell mandatory to get through your other plays, or 4 out of 5 off of most of our 1.5 card combos. But if you don't mind going over 40 cards or ditching some of the more generic support, Fracture Dance does offer some very solid flexibility, especially when you have a bit of matchup knowledge as well. Alright, Hand Trap Speedrun section. We're on double Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Just a nice mid-tier hand trap right now that is very flexible. We're down to 2 copies of it instead of 3 because I needed to cut 2 cards per deck space, and I figured I'll just cut 2 of the hard ones per turn hand traps and move the 3rd copies of them to the side deck for the moment. 3 copies of The Boy from Outer Space, Nibiru the Primal Being. Just a quick note, Nibiru does conflict with Tatsuno Otoshigo's special summon effect, but if you open with either Darkblade or combo, you can skip ahead to getting your fusion spell in rotation and then pop Nibiru with the fusion spells in graveyard effect, and then from there you just do a reordered version of whatever combo you're going for. Triple copies of Effect Veil are generically good right now. 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. Again, generically good right now. And closing out the hand traps, a new addition, double copies of Ghost Mortar and Moonlit Chill. I've always liked this card, and I think it fits an interesting niche of, while being more limited in specifically needing to be used in response to the special summon a monster, the fact that unlike Imperm, it can be used from the hand while you have a field, and unlike Effect Veiler, does in fact work outside of the opponent's main phase, it lets her fill a nice little niche of effect negation that those 2 cards miss. Plus the chip damage does come up for this deck pretty often. Again, we are down from 3 copies of this to 2 for deck space, and I do want to leave Veiler and Imperm at 3 because they are both non-once per turns, while she is a hard once per turn. And closing out the main deck, we just have a few last bit of supporting cards. We're on 1 copy of Called by the Grave to help protect our plays. We're on 1 copy of Reinforcement of the Army. It is a 4th copy of Darkblade and sometimes really nice Ash Blossom bait. 1 copy of 1-for-1. Goblin is a 1-card engine and is much better when we don't have to commit our normal summon to him. 1 bit of sequencing that I do want to mention, if you ever open an extra Memento, Bone Party, and 1-for-1 and need to jumpstart a play, always try with the Bone Party first, as the destruction of the monster in hand is part of the effect and not a cost, meaning that you will lose nothing if it's negated, whereas the send to graveyard via 1-for-1 is a cost. So if it is hit with Ash or otherwise negated, you will lose out on that monster. We have cut Triple Tactics Thrust entirely from the deck, and in its place we are playing 2 copies of Triple Tactics Talents. This deck can play through a single hand trap pretty consistently, so being able to not only snipe out additional interaction from your opponent's hand before continuing, but also gaining matchup knowledge is incredibly strong. This deck puts up some very strong boards that have a lot of capacity to stop our opponent's plays, but at times there is very little room for error, so that hand knowledge can become invaluable. Worst case, the draw 2 is nice, as Bone Party is generally going to be able to kickstart a stopped play, or the fusion spell in some cases, Tatsuno Toshigo, and even 1-for-1 as well. And surprise, post-ban list re-recording, we've added 2 copies of Cross-Out Designator back into the deck. This is primarily for Nibiru, as while this deck can play around Nibiru, I prefer to not have to, and I do expect Nibiru to be pretty hot for the format post-ban list. Additionally, it does help push our plays through since we're already rocking most major hand traps anyway, and if we have to use Cross-Out earlier in the turn, we just adjust our end board if we are particularly afraid of Nibiru. Alright, so time for the extra deck. First off, we're on double copies of Memento Twin Dragon, our newest piece of monster support. We're going to cover it later, but we do have 2 flex spots in this extra deck, and you could realistically knock Twin Dragon down to 1 and not miss it if you do want a 3rd flex spot, but I like the peace of mind of having a 2nd copy just in case. Next, one copy of Guardian Chimera because it's semi-generic and does come up. Just remember, you cannot ever use materials from the graveyard via our fusion spell for this fella because he specifies that his materials has to come from both the field and hand. A new addition to the extra deck, we're on one copy of Chimera, King of the Phantom Beasts. He comes up once in a while and can be fun if you don't need to route through Twin Dragon. Generally, this is if you were hand trapped, then use Triple Tactics Talents and sniped a card from hand, and can get away with playing Wave 2 Memento for a turn. This will force our opponent to play with a 3-card hand off the draw, plus he doesn't need to stay on field to get that discard effect, so we can immediately use him for fuel for our fusion spell's secondary effect afterwards. One Xyz monster in Super Star Slayer Typhon Sky Crisis, a name that I will never get tired of saying. It comes up a bit, and it's just a good generic extra deck monster to have access to. Our access code line consists of Relinquished Anima, Dark the Dark Charmer, Selene, Queen of the Master Magicians, and again, I remind you that Anguish is natively a spellcaster whose effect triggers on her special summon regardless of how she is special summoned, and finally the boy himself, access code Talker. Additionally, for the Link 4 department, a new card in Unchained Abomination. He is pretty cool, giving you some additional upside to the destruction effects that you're already doing. I toyed around with the idea of running a little bit more of an Unchained Link package, but it got a little bit clunky and I don't think you would consistently be able to use it. But Abomination, when it does come up, is super helpful. We have the space for it, and it's another great card to go into off of IP Masquerena in some situations. So I do suggest keeping him around, but he could be considered a 3rd or 4th flex spot, depending on how many Twin Dragons you want to run. And now for the IP Masquerena package, aka the Girl Gang. We have IP Masquerena herself, SP Little Knight, and Underworld Goddess of the Closed World. Budget players, SP Little Knight can be replaced with Nightmare Unicorn, plus if you use the alternate art, you can keep the Girl Gang section theming here as well. Mace makes IP Masquerena incredibly strong in this deck and vice versa, so even if you don't have SP Little Knight and are going into Underworld Goddess of the Closed World, off the back of a good hand you'll have more than enough materials to do this. It is still a remarkably strong play. And don't forget about good old Unchained Mega Doggo here as well, as it is another viable option to go into off of IP Masquerena. And now for the last 2 slots, these are more or less flex spots here. Somehow Memento took a ban list hit, no more Link Karibo. It was pretty niche usage anyway. Instead, we are going to go ahead and rock Appaloosa, Bow of the Goddess. The ever-growing girl gang that makes this deck tick has a new member. In theory, we can make her turn 1, ending on her as our support monster instead of IP and or SP, but that is really confined to hands that really let you overextend, but it does happen from time to time. Otherwise, it's just another very solid option to go into off of IP Masquerena if you don't necessarily need the SP Little Knight, considering IP Masquerena is 2 materials worth of Link, plus with Witch or Gaddock, whichever you use to get Mace, and then whatever you stole from your opponent with Mace, gives us a 3 negate Appaloosa with the IP Masquerena protection. And additionally, we have the battle protection provided by Cranium Burst most likely. Appaloosa comments Cranium Burst very well as she can negate off-field activations and give us a second negation in a chain if needed. And lastly, for our final flex spot, I'm currently playing Skystriker Ace Azalea. Just a fun generic Link 2 that can clear a target and probably herself, giving you a clean field to go into Tatsuno Otoshigo if need be. But this spot could also be either Fire Charmer or Lila the Light Charmer, or even Ausa the Earth Charmer. Remember, Tatsuno Otoshigo is an Earth, and that just makes our access code lines a little bit more varied. And now for the side deck. As always, adjust as per your local meta or event, but this is what I'm currently rocking immediately out of the new ban list. Triple copies of Droll for a bit of hand trap variety if needed. 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster, and triple Cosmic Cyclones for back row removal alongside the recurable Fracture Dance that is already in the main. Our 3rd copy of Ash and our 3rd copy of Ghost Mourner. Honestly, these might swap out, but post-ban list, I haven't had a ton of time to test out new side deck stuff, and I just wanted to keep access to, at minimum, 3 copies of Ash Blossom. And I'm still working out what the other 15th card in our side deck would be, so Ghost Mourner is going to be chilling there for the moment. Triple copies of Evenly Matched. I think Evenly is a lot stronger now with Barone and to a lesser extent Borreload Savage Dragon out of the picture, taking away the every deck generic Omni Negate. So if our opponent veers in and goes very heavy on monster negation or just is playing a ton of back row, this can absolutely clean house. And lastly, these are 3 flex spots in the side deck. I'm currently playing triple copies of Solemn Judgment just as a nice be-all end-all answer to most board-breaking threats that our opponent might be playing if we opt to go first, games 2 or 3. You could also play Super Polymerization here if you want. I don't particularly like it, but it is definitely a solid option, and it would let you use those 2 flex spots in the extra deck for Super Poly targets. By the way, again, playing in paper, I have to just call this out. Combined Creation is very difficult to remove via Super Poly at the start of an opponent's turn because it is an Earth Worm. So a lot of players online will fire off Super Poly and just end up hitting Horn Dragon and IP Masquerena instead of the Combined Creation, leaving Combined Creation and all of its secondary interaction that it's enabling intact. I've actually had people ask before, why couldn't I Super Poly that monster? And I just get to point out that it's not a dark, it's a Earth Worm. Really weird typing on that boy. So that's the deck. I've been having a lot of success with it, and I think it's not only a ton of fun, but with the new support, it's also a competitively viable deck. I will say though, it is not the easiest deck to play, just being really open about it. And a lot of the lines are a bit weird, it can get very non-linear, but it will absolutely reward you for thinking on the fly, really getting to know why you're doing everything you're doing, all the different ways to get from point A to point B, and going into your opponent's turn and having surgical precision with all of your interactions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop it a like and subscribe to the channel for even more. And don't forget to check out the rest of the Memento playlist to get a start on this very fun deck, and I will catch you all later.